The Alpha King's blood stained the snow crimson, and Lydia Hawthorne knew that if she let him die, this winter would be her last. 6 miles. She had 6 miles to drag a dying wolf through a blizzard that had already claimed 3 lives this season. The storm howled around her like a living thing, hungry and relentless, turning the Montana wilderness into a white hell that swallowed sound and sight alike. Her hands burned where they gripped the massive black wolf's scruff, but she couldn't let go. Wouldn't let go. Something deeper than reason commanded her forward, one agonizing step after another. The wolf was enormous, easily twice her weight, with fur as dark as a moonless night, shot through with silver that caught what little light pierced the storm. Blood matted his coat from wounds that smelled wrong. Wolfsbane. She recognized the bitter tang from her father's teachings back when Dr. Samuel Hawthorne had still been alive to teach her anything at all. But there was something else mixed with the poison, something metallic and deadly. Silver. Someone had wanted this wolf dead. Someone had crafted a poison specifically designed to kill an alpha. Lydia's boots sank into snow that reached her knees, each step a battle against cold and exhaustion. Her worn coat did little against the wind that cut through fabric like knives through paper. 4 years of surviving alone in the frozen peaks had taught her to read weather, to sense when storms would break and when they would rage for days. This one would rage. This one would kill anything caught outside when night fell, and night was coming fast. She should leave him. Logic screamed it with every labored breath that clouded the air before her face. She didn't know this wolf. For all she knew, he could be a rogue, an outcast, someone dangerous who deserved whatever fate had dealt him. The smart thing, the safe thing would be to let the storm take him while she made for her cabin alone. But when she tried to release his scruff, when she tried to take that first step away, pain lanced through her chest so sharp she gasped. Her wolf, that broken, fractured thing that hadn't fully manifested since her ritual failure 7 years ago, suddenly howled to life inside her. Not with fear or weakness, but with desperate, absolute certainty. Save him. Protect. Mine. The word echoed in her skull with a force that drove her to her knees in the snow. Mine. She didn't understand it, didn't want to understand it, but she couldn't fight it either. Her hands found his fur again, and the moment her fingers made contact, electricity shot through her body. Power, not hers, but flowing into her anyway, filling muscles that had been screaming with exhaustion. Her wolf sang a sound of pure recognition that she'd never heard before, not even in the days before the pack had rejected her as broken and worthless. Lydia stood the impossible weight of the wolf, suddenly manageable, and resumed her march through hell. The journey stretched into eternity. Time lost meaning when every moment was identical, white chaos when every step could be her last, when the only real things in the universe were the wolf's warmth against her shoulders and the mate bond she didn't yet have a name for pulling her forward. She fell twice. Both times she dragged herself upright through sheer stubborn will, refusing to let the storm win. 3 miles in, the wolf stopped breathing. Lydia's heart seized. She dropped to her knees beside him, hands frantically searching for a pulse she couldn't find through thick fur and her own numb fingers. No, not after coming this far. Not when something fundamental inside her was screaming that losing him would shatter her in ways she couldn't survive. She tried to shift, to call on her wolf for the strength she'd need to restart his heart. The transformation had never come easily, had never come completely, but desperation made her reckless. Her bones began to crack and reshape, pain exploding through her body as muscle and sinew tried to reform into something they'd forgotten how to be. Her wolf surged forward, and for the first time in 7 years, Lydia felt whole. The shift completed in a cascade of chestnut fur and changed perspective. She was smaller in this form, built for speed rather than power, but she was complete. Her wolf had answered. After years of silence, after a ritual that had left her branded as broken before her entire pack, she had shifted fully and perfectly. But there was no time to marvel at the miracle. The massive black wolf still wasn't breathing. Lydia pressed her muzzle against his chest, feeling for movement that wasn't there. Then she did what instinct demanded, what her wolf knew, even if her human mind questioned the mechanics. She bit down on the thick fur over his heart, not breaking skin, but applying pressure in a rhythm her wolf understood. 1, 2, 3. Breathe for him. Force life back into a body that was trying to give up. 30 seconds that felt like 30 hours. Then his chest heaved. Once. Twice. Regular breathing resumed, shallow but steady. Relief made her legs weak. She shifted back to human form, the transformation smooth in reverse, now that something inside her had finally clicked into place and grabbed his scruff again. 3 miles left. She could do 3 miles. The cabin appeared through the white like salvation itself, a small structure of rough-hewn logs and a stone chimney that promised warmth and safety. Lydia had built it herself over 4 years of solitary survival, using skills her father had taught her before his death. It was crude and tiny, barely large enough for one person, but it was hers, her sanctuary. Her hiding place from a world that had decided she wasn't worth keeping. She shouldered through the door, dragging the wolf inside, and collapsed beside him on the floor. Her body shook with exhaustion and cold muscles screaming from exertion that should have been impossible. But she'd done it. 6 miles through a killer storm, carrying a creature that outweighed her by 100 pounds. The fire in her hearth had burned down to coals, but coals could be rebuilt. Lydia forced herself upright on trembling legs, stripped off her soaked coat, and set about building heat back into the small space. Only when flames crackled with steady life did she turn her attention to her unexpected guest. In the dim firelight, he looked even larger than he had in the storm. Blood stained her floor where he lay, a growing pool that spoke of how serious his injuries were. Those wounds needed immediate attention, or her rescue would mean nothing. Lydia grabbed her supplies, the herbs and tools her father had taught her to use back when she'd been his assistant, back when she dreamed of becoming a healer like him, instead of a reject hiding in the mountains. Her hands moved with familiar precision, cleaning wounds, packing them with poultices that would draw out poison. The wolfsbane was bad enough, but the silver mixed with it created a compound that would kill even the strongest alpha. She worked through the night, changing dressings, checking his breathing, keeping the fire fed. Exhaustion pulled at her bones, but she didn't dare sleep. Not when his life hung by such a fragile thread. Not when losing him would mean losing something she hadn't known she needed until she'd found him bleeding in the snow. Dawn came, gradually gray light filtering through her single window to illuminate a room that reeked of blood and herbs. His lungs still labored against the poison, each inhale a stuttering victory, but the rhythm held steady enough to suggest he'd see another day. He would live at least through the day. Whether he'd thank her for the rescue or curse her for interfering remained to be seen. Lydia settled onto the floor beside him, her back against the wall, and allowed herself one small truth. For the first time in 4 years of solitude, she wasn't alone. And somehow, terrifyingly, that changed everything. The wolf didn't wake on the first day. Lydia changed his poultices 3 times, her hands moving with the precision her father had drilled into her during years of training. Each time she peeled away the herb-soaked cloth, she expected to find the wounds unchanged or worsening. Instead, they looked better. Not healed, but closing faster than any injury should, especially ones contaminated with wolfsbane and silver. That shouldn't be possible. She'd seen strong alphas recover from similar wounds during her time with Silverpine Pack, back before they'd rejected her. It took weeks, not hours. Life moved through him in slow, determined waves now. Where his breathing had been shallow before it came deeper, now stronger, his body beginning to win the war against silver and wolfsbane. Lydia sat back on her heels, studying the creature in the firelight. His fur was remarkable up close, black as a moonless night, but threaded through with silver that seemed to shimmer when the flames danced. She'd never seen coloring quite like it. Her own wolf stirred beneath her skin, pressing forward with an insistence that felt foreign. For 7 years, that presence had been barely a whisper, a ghost of what it should have been. Now it paced restlessly, focused entirely on the massive creature occupying most of her cabin floor. "What are you trying to tell me?" Lydia asked the silent animal in her mind. "Important," her wolf seemed to whisper back. "He is important." The word resonated through her chest, carrying weight she didn't understand. Important, how important to whom? She was a rejected omega living in isolation. Nothing and no one was important to her survival except herself. Yet she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward the stranger. When she'd carried him through the blizzard, touching his fur had filled her with strength she'd never possessed. Even now, sitting beside him, she felt more whole than she had in years, as if some missing piece had finally clicked into place. She spent the day preparing more poultices and checking his wounds repeatedly. The improvement continued to astound her. By evening, several of the smaller cuts had closed completely, leaving only faint pink lines beneath the fur. The larger wounds still seeped, but even they showed remarkable progress. "What brought you to my mountain, stranger?" she murmured to the silent creature beside her as darkness settled over the cabin. The cabin was small, barely large enough for her narrow-bedded table in the fireplace. With the massive wolf stretched across the floor, space was even more limited. She dragged her blankets down to sleep near the fire, as telling herself it was practical. The wolf needed warmth to heal. It had nothing to do with the strange comfort she felt in his presence. She laid a hand on his shoulder, fingers sinking into thick fur. That same electric sensation sparked through her palm, traveling up her arm and into her chest, where her own wolf responded with something that felt almost like contentment. Lydia closed her eyes, letting the feeling wash over her. For the first time since her father's death 4 years ago, she didn't feel entirely alone. Sleep claimed her, gradually pulled under by exhaustion and the warmth of the fire. She dreamed of running through forests she'd never seen, of a voice calling her name in tones that made her heart race. The dreams felt significant, heavy with meaning she couldn't quite grasp. Dawn light filtering through the window woke her on the third morning. She opened her eyes slowly, consciousness returning in stages. The fire had burned low. She needed to add wood. Her body ached from sleeping on the hard floor. Her hands still rested on fur that was warm and solid beneath her palm. Not fur. Lydia's eyes snapped fully open. Her hand rested on skin. Smooth, scarred skin stretched over muscle that tensed beneath her touch. She jerked back, scrambling away until her spine hit the cabin wall. Where the wolf had been, a man now lay. He was massive, even in human form, easily filling the space the wolf had occupied. Broad shoulders tapered to a lean waist, every inch of him built with the kind of strength that came from years of physical training. Scars crisscrossed his torso, old wounds that spoke of countless battles. His face, partially obscured by black hair that fell past his shoulders, was striking in its harsh beauty. A full beard covered his jaw, well kept despite his current state. Even unconscious and injured, he radiated the kind of power that made lesser wolves submit instinctively. An alpha, no question. But more than that, the aura rolling off him pressed against her senses with overwhelming force. This was no ordinary pack alpha. This was something else entirely. Lydia forced herself to breathe steadily, to think past the shock. Shifters transformed when unconscious, sometimes usually when their bodies decided the other form would heal faster. She'd read about it in her father's journals, though she'd never witnessed it personally. The fact that this man had remained a wolf for 2 days before shifting suggested the animal form had been necessary to survive the initial trauma. She grabbed a blanket and covered him, averting her eyes from his nakedness, even as heat crept up her neck. 4 years of isolation hadn't completely erased her sense of propriety. Once he was covered, she moved closer, checking his wounds with clinical detachment, or trying to. Her hands trembled slightly as she peeled back the blanket to examine the injuries that had looked so severe on the wolf. In human form, they appeared even more deadly. Deep gouges across his ribs had barely closed. Puncture wounds dotted his shoulders and back. The smell of wolfsbane still clung to his skin, mixed with that metallic tang of silver. Someone had wanted him dead. Someone had used weapons specifically designed to kill shifters. As she cleaned the wounds with fresh water, the man stirred. His breathing changed, becoming rapid and shallow. A low sound escaped his throat, not quite a growl, but close. His head turned restlessly, dark hair falling away from his face. No, he muttered the word rough and barely intelligible. Can't let them. Lydia froze her cloth, hovering above his chest. He was delirious, caught in fever dreams. She should stay quiet, let him work through it. But curiosity and concern warred within her. You're safe, she said softly, the first words she'd spoken to him as a man. Rest. His eyes snapped open and Lydia's breath caught. They were amber bright as the heart of a flame and filled with a wild intensity that pinned her in place. For a moment, those eyes focused on her with perfect clarity. His lips moved, forming a word that seemed dragged from somewhere deep. Mate. Then his eyes rolled back and unconsciousness claimed him again. Lydia sat motionless, her heart pounding so hard she could hear blood rushing in her ears. Mate. He'd called her mate. The word resonated through her wolf, who surged forward with sudden fierce recognition. But that was impossible. She'd never met this man before. Mate bonds didn't work that way. They required time proximity, mutual recognition. Unless the stories she'd heard as a child were true, the ones about fated mates who recognized each other instantly, whose souls called to each other across distance and circumstance. She'd always thought those were fantasies, tales told to make young wolves dream of romance instead of facing the reality of political matches and pack alliances. "You're delirious," she told the unconscious man firmly, as if he could hear her. "You don't know what you're saying." But her wolf disagreed vehemently, pacing and pushing against her control with unusual strength. "Mine," it seemed to say. "Ours, protect." Over the next hours, the man's fever worsened. He thrashed weakly, muttering words that made no sense strung together, but painted a picture of betrayal and desperation. He spoke of poison and councils of enemies wearing friendly faces. A name came up repeatedly, sometimes as a curse, sometimes as a plea. "Silas. Silas," he gasped during one particularly violent spell. "Get back and tell them the traitor." His body convulsed, and Lydia held him down using the blanket to keep him from injuring himself further. She pressed cool cloths to his forehead, forced water between his lips when she could, and prayed to God she'd stop believing in years ago that he would survive him. As the third day bled into the fourth, the fever finally broke. The man's thrashing subsided, his breathing evening out into true sleep rather than unconscious delirium. Lydia sagged with relief, exhaustion pulling at her bones. She'd barely slept since finding him too afraid that if she looked away for even a moment, death would claim him. The storm outside had finally quieted. Through the window, she could see pale sunlight struggling through heavy clouds. They were still snowed in, but the worst had passed. She should feel relieved. Instead, she felt trapped in a different way. Trapped by the presence of this stranger who called her mate, who carried wounds that spoke of deadly enemies, who radiated power that made her wolf sing. "Who are you?" she whispered to the sleeping man. "And what have I brought into my home?" He didn't answer, but she hadn't expected him to. Tomorrow he might wake fully. Tomorrow she would demand answers. But tonight, as the fire crackled and the stranger's chest rose and fell, with steady breath, Lydia allowed herself to wonder if perhaps she'd saved him for a reason. If perhaps, against all logic and self-preservation, he truly was exactly what he'd called her, his mate. Morning of the fourth day arrived with crystalline clarity, the kind of winter brightness that made snow sparkle like diamonds and turned the frozen peaks into something almost beautiful. Lydia woke to find sunlight streaming through her window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air, and illuminating amber eyes watching her from across the cabin floor. She sat up slowly, suddenly aware of how she must look after 3 days of intensive nursing with minimal sleep. Her chestnut hair hung in tangles around her face, and she knew her clothes were stained with blood and herbs. But the man's gaze held no judgment, only an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "You're awake," she managed, proud that her voice didn't shake. How long? His voice was deep, roughened by disuse and injury, but carrying an undertone of command that marked him as someone accustomed to being obeyed. "4 days since I found you. 3 since you shifted." He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it, pain lancing across his features. Lydia was moving before conscious thought caught up her hands on his shoulders, easing him back down. "Don't move yet. Your wounds are barely closed. You'll tear them open." The moment her hands made contact with his skin, electricity shot through both of them. The man's eyes widened fractionally, his gaze dropping to where her fingers pressed against his shoulders, then lifting to meet hers. Time seemed to suspend. The mate bond, unnamed but undeniable, pulled taut between them. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice dropping to something dangerous and dark. Lydia forced herself to pull her hands away, though every instinct screamed to maintain contact. "Lydia. Lydia Hawthorne. I found you injured in the forest. I couldn't leave you there." "Why not?" "You don't know me. I could be dangerous." The blunt question caught her off guard. She could lie, could pretend it had been simple human decency, but something about those amber eyes demanded honesty. "My wolf wouldn't let me leave. It told me I had to save you. It didn't give me a choice." Understanding flickered across his face there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. He knew what that meant, knew what the bond between them was, even if she'd only begun to suspect. "I owe you my life," he said simply. "You do." She sat back on her heels, trying to maintain some semblance of professional distance. "Now tell me who you are and why someone wanted you dead badly enough to use wolfsbane and silver together." The man studied her for a long moment, and she could practically see him weighing how much truth to offer. When he finally spoke, she had the distinct impression he was choosing his words carefully. My name is Kade Wolfhart. I'm an alpha from a territory south of here. I was attending a council meeting when someone poisoned the wine. Wolfsbane and silver mixed in a way that would kill slowly. I shifted and fled before they could finish what they'd started. Lydia's eyes narrowed. The frozen peaks are nowhere near any southern territories. How did you end up here, Instinct? That much was clearly true. When you're dying and running blind, you don't choose direction. You just run. His amber gaze held hers. My wolf brought me here. To you. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Lydia stood, needing movement, needing to do something with her hands. She ladled stew into a wooden bowl, trying to ignore how her pulse hammered at her throat. Can you sit up enough to eat? Kade managed to prop himself against the wall, accepting the bowl with hands that trembled slightly. The weakness clearly infuriated him, but he forced it down. As he ate, Lydia kept her distance, watching him with careful eyes. She'd lived alone for 4 years, had learned to read people and situations for threats. This man was dangerous not because he meant her harm, but because of what he represented. Change. Connection. Everything she'd fled into these mountains to escape. When he'd finished, she took back the empty bowl. Tell me about your pack. Your territory. Kade's jaw tightened. What would you like to know? Start with why someone wanted you dead badly enough to craft a poison specifically designed to kill alphas. His laugh was bitter. Politics. Power. The usual reasons people betray those they claim to serve. I have enemies, Lydia Hawthorne. Powerful ones. And now that they've failed to kill me once, they'll try again. Then why stay here? You should leave as soon as you can travel. Draw them away from my home. Something flickered in his eyes that might have been hurt, but it vanished too quickly to name. You're right, I should, but I need a few more days to regain my strength. And there's something I need to tell you first. Lydia crossed her arms, a defensive gesture she recognized but couldn't stop. What I know who you are, or rather, I knew your father. The world tilted. Lydia gripped the edge of her table, knuckles white. What did you just say, Dr. Samuel Hawthorne? He worked for my territory for 5 years before his death. He was more than just a healer. He was a friend, a confidant, one of the few wolves I trusted completely. Her father. This stranger had known her father. The implications crashed over her like a wave. How much had Samuel told him? Did he know about her failed ritual, about the rejection, about the daughter who'd run away rather than face an unwanted marriage? He died 4 years ago. Lydia said, her voice barely above a whisper. They said it was an accident. Kade's expression hardened. It wasn't. Your father was investigating something before he died. Something about corruption in the territory's inner circle. He was close to having proof when he fell. The timing was too convenient. You think he was murdered? I know he was, but I couldn't prove it. Not without evidence. Not without risking war between territories. His amber eyes held hers with uncomfortable intensity. The same person who poisoned me killed your father, Lydia. I'm certain of it. Who? The word came out sharp as broken glass. A man named Silas Blackwood, my royal counselor. He'd been with the territory for decades, was trusted by everyone, including me. But your father suspected him of embezzling, of selling territory secrets, of consolidating power for a coup. He was investigating when he died. Rage, hot and bright, flooded through Lydia's veins. You knew this and did nothing. Kade's voice went hard. I had suspicions, not proof. If I'd accused Silas without evidence, he would have turned half the territory against me. Hundreds would have died in civil war. I needed to be certain before making a move. And now he's revealed himself. He poisoned me, used the same method I suspect he used on your father. I have enough to act. Lydia turned away, emotions roiling too violently to contain. Her father, murdered by some power-hungry counselor who'd betrayed his alpha's trust. And this man, this Kade Wolfhart, had known and done nothing for 4 years. Strong hands gripped her shoulders, turning her around. Kade had stood, despite his injuries, despite the pain that tightened his features. He towered over her, his presence overwhelming in the small space. I swear to you, he said, his voice low and fierce, I will kill Silas Blackwood for what he did to your father, and for what he tried to do to me. But I need your help. My help. What could I possibly do? Come with me. When I return to my territory, be my mate, Lydia, accept the bond between us. She stepped back or tried to. His hands remained firm on her shoulders, not constraining, but steadying. You don't even know me. I know enough. I know you're strong enough to drag an alpha twice your weight 6 miles through a blizzard. I know you're skilled enough to treat injuries that should have killed me. I know your wolf recognizes mine, and mine recognizes yours. That's enough. It's not. Lydia forced herself to meet his eyes. You're asking me to leave the only safety I've known in 4 years. To walk back into a world that rejected me, that called me broken and worthless. All for a man I just met in a bond I don't fully understand. Then let me show you. His thumbs traced small circles on her shoulders, the gesture oddly gentle from someone so clearly built for violence. Let me prove that your wolf knows what your mind is still fighting. How shift with me, run with me, let me teach you what your pack should have. The offer hung between them, tempting and terrifying in equal measure. Part of Lydia wanted to refuse to cling to her isolation and safety, but a larger part, the part that had shifted fully for the first time while saving his life, wanted desperately to say yes. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of winter day that made the Montana wilderness look deceptively peaceful. Kade was stronger, able to move without obvious pain, though Lydia knew the deep wounds weren't fully healed yet. He'd heal faster than a normal wolf, faster even than a normal alpha, but he wasn't invincible. They stood outside her cabin, snow crunching under their boots, breath clouding the air between them. Close your eyes, Kade instructed. Stop thinking about what happened during your ritual. Stop thinking about what they said you were. Just feel. Lydia obeyed, the cold air sharp against her face. She could sense Kade behind her, close enough that his warmth touched her back, but not quite making contact. Call to her, he murmured near her ear, his breath ghosting across her skin. Not with desperation or fear, with certainty. She's yours. She's always been yours. For long minutes, nothing happened. Then power rippled across Lydia's skin, visible as a shimmer in the air. Her form began to blur, bones shifting, muscles reforming. The transformation was smoother this time, less painful, more natural. When it completed, she stood on 4 legs, her chestnut coat bright against the snow. Kade shifted, then letting his wolf emerge. The massive black wolf was even more impressive in daylight, easily twice her size, with those distinctive silver threads running through his fur and amber eyes that seemed to see straight through her. He approached slowly, touching his nose to hers in the traditional greeting between wolves who recognized each other as something more than strangers. Mine, his wolf seemed to say. Ours, protect. They ran together through the forest, Lydia experiencing the freedom of full shifting for the first time in her adult life. Kade led the way, protective but not controlling, showing her how to move through the terrain with confidence. They hunted together, bringing down a rabbit that they shared and played in the snow, like cubs despite their age. When they finally shifted back, standing in the clearing, as the sun began to set, Lydia looked at her hands as if seeing them for the first time. I did it. I actually did it. Kade stepped closer, his expression warm in a way she hadn't seen before. You were never broken, Lydia. Just buried under lies told by wolves too blind to see your worth. Something shifted in the air between them. The mate bond pulled taut, demanding acknowledgement, demanding action. Lydia's breath caught as Kade lowered his head, his intention clear. She could step away, could stop this before it began. But she didn't want to. The kiss was fire and recognition, his mouth claiming hers with an intensity that stole her breath. She responded with equal hunger, years of loneliness and isolation and pouring into that connection. They stumbled back toward the cabin, hands, roaming clothes in the way. But at the threshold, Kade pulled back, his breathing ragged. No, not like this. Lydia stared at him, confused and hurt by the rejection. Why? Because when I claim you, I want to do it properly. Not in a cabin in the middle of nowhere while I'm still being hunted. You deserve better than that. You deserve to be treated like the queen you are. I don't care about those things. But I do. He cupped her face, his touch tender, despite the roughness of his hands. You deserve everything, Lydia Hawthorne. And I'm going to give it to you. Once I've dealt with Silas and the threat he represents. The next morning arrived too quickly. Kade was strong enough to travel, and staying longer only increased the danger to them both. Lydia knew this intellectually, but her heart protested every moment of his preparations to leave. I'll send my beta back in 10 days, he told her, as he gathered what few supplies she could spare. His name is Garrett Stone. If you decide to accept the bond to be my mate, go with him. He'll bring you to me safely. And if I don't accept, pain flickered across his features there and gone in a heartbeat, then I'll respect your choice. But know this, Lydia. You're mine whether you accept it or not. Whether you run to the ends of the earth or stay here in your mountain sanctuary, the bond between us won't break just because you refuse to acknowledge it. He stepped close, towering over her in the small cabin, his hand coming up to tilt her chin so she had to meet his eyes. Think about everything your pack took from you. Think about your father's death going unavenged. Think about spending the rest of your life alone in these mountains, hiding from a world that was too stupid to see what you really are. Then he kissed her again, this kiss different from the first. This one was a promise, a claim, a vow. When he pulled away, Lydia's lips were swollen and her heart raced. 10 days, he repeated. Then he was gone, disappearing into the forest with the kind of speed that spoke of complete healing. Lydia stood in her doorway long after he'd vanished from sight, one hand pressed to her sternum, where the mate bond pulled with physical pain. Her wolf whined, distressed by their mate's departure, demanding they follow. But Lydia's human mind needed time. Time to process. Time to decide. Time to figure out if she was brave enough to walk back into a world that had broken her once already. She turned back to her cabin, to her small, safe life, to 4 years of careful isolation. Everything here was known, controlled, safe. Accepting Kade's offer meant risking that safety, meant opening herself up to rejection again, to pain, to all the things she'd fled into these mountains to escape. But it also meant revenge for her father. Justice for Samuel Hawthorne, who died investigating corruption while his daughter hid in the wilderness. It meant accepting a power she'd only just discovered, a wolf that had been buried but never truly broken. It meant belonging to someone who looked at her like she was valuable, like she was precious, like she was exactly what he needed. 10 days to decide. 10 days to choose between safety and destiny. 10 days to figure out if she was brave enough to be the woman Kade Wolfhart believed she could be. Lydia closed the cabin door and sank onto her bed, her wolf pacing restlessly inside her, already knowing what choice they would make, even if her human mind still struggled with the answer. 3 days crawled by, like wounded animals, each hour stretching longer than the last. Lydia moved through her routines with mechanical precision, checking her snares, mending clothes, splitting firewood for a hearth that suddenly seemed too large for one person. But her mind remained trapped in the moment. Kade Wolfhart had walked out of her cabin and into the forest, taking something vital with him. The mate bond ached constantly now, a hollow sensation in her chest that grew worse with each passing hour. Her wolf whined and paced, scratching at the inside of her ribs like a caged animal desperate for freedom. 7 days remained until Garrett Stone would arrive. 7 days to make a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. She was fishing at the frozen lake on the 11th day when the first foreign scent reached her nostrils. Lydia's wolf surged to attention, hackles rising in warning. Multiple wolves, 6, maybe 7, moving with purpose through the forest, their scents deliberately upwind. They wanted her to know they were coming, wanted her to feel the trap closing. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, gathering her fishing gear and the 2 trout she'd caught. She could make it back to the cabin bar, the door wait them out. But something in the synchronized way they were moving, the methodical pattern of their approach, told her running wouldn't help. These weren't rogues or random travelers. These were hunters, and she was the prey. Lydia was halfway back to the cabin when they emerged from the tree line. 6 men, all radiating the dominant energy of seasoned warriors. Mercenaries, she realized with sinking dread. The kind of wolves who sold their loyalty to the highest bidder, who had no pack bonds to restrain their cruelty. The leader was massive, his face a roadmap of scars that spoke of battles survived through sheer viciousness. Cold eyes assessed her like merchandise, calculating her value with the detachment of a man who'd done this kind of work too many times to count. Lydia Hawthorne, the leader, said, his voice rough as gravel. "You're coming with us." Her wolf didn't hesitate. The shift came smoothly now, power flooding through her as bones restructured and fur erupted across her skin. She'd been weak once, broken, unable to call on this part of herself. But Kade had shown her the truth. She'd never been broken, only buried. The chestnut wolf that emerged was smaller than these males, built for speed rather than power. But what she lacked in size, she made up for in desperation and newly awakened ferocity. She launched herself at the nearest mercenary teeth, finding his throat before he could react. Hot blood filled her mouth as she ripped and tore, the taste of violence foreign but necessary. The man went down, screaming, hands clutching at the ruin of his neck. Lydia didn't wait to watch him die. She spun claws, raking across another mercenary's face, opening cuts that would scar even after healing. A third lunged for her, but she was faster, smaller, able to slip under his guard and hamstring him with a vicious bite that sent him crashing into the snow. For 30 glorious seconds, she believed she might actually win. 3 enemies down, 3 still standing. She'd survived 4 years alone in the frozen peaks. She knew how to find weak points and exploit them, how to use terrain and speed to overcome superior strength. Then silver chains snapped around her throat. The metal burned like fire, searing through fur and forcing her shift in a cascade of agony. One moment she was a wolf, powerful and fierce. The next she was human, naked, vulnerable, collapsing into the snow as more chains wrapped around her wrists and ankles. The silver blocked everything, severed her connection to her wolf, left her as helpless as she'd been before Kade had shown her what she could be. The leader planted his boot between her shoulder blades, pressing her face into the frozen ground. His weight was crushing, deliberate, designed to show her exactly how powerless she'd become. "Feisty little thing," he commented, grinding his boot down harder. "Silas said you were broken, but you've got teeth, Omega, real teeth." The name made her blood run cold. Silas, the man who'd murdered her father. The man who'd poisoned Kade. The conspiracy reached further and deeper than she'd imagined, with tendrils that had found her even in her mountain sanctuary. "Touch me, and the Alpha King will kill you." Lydia spat snow and blood mixing in her mouth. The leader laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humor. "Alpha King, that bastard thinks he's safe, does he? But we know. We always know." They hauled her upright, her naked skin exposed to brutal cold, and one of the mercenaries threw a rough blanket over her shoulders. Not mercy, just practicality. They needed her alive for whatever Silas had planned. Lydia Hawthorne, the leader, continued gripping her jaw and forcing her to meet his eyes. "Mate to Kade Wolfhart, Alpha King of the 7 territories. Worth more than gold to the right buyer." The world tilted. Alpha King. Not just an alpha. Not just the leader of some southern territory. Kade Wolfhart was the supreme authority over every shifter pack from the southern reach to the frozen peaks. Every alpha she'd ever known, including the ones who'd rejected her, answered to him. He'd lied to her, hidden the truth behind careful omissions and partial revelations. The man she'd saved, the man she'd kissed, the man her wolf had claimed as mate, was the most powerful shifter in existence. "You're lying," she whispered, but the words held no conviction. "Am I?" The leader released her jaw roughly. The moment that royal bastard crawled into the frozen peaks half dead, Silas knew. "We've had eyes on these mountains for weeks, watching, waiting. And the moment you carried him home and played nursemaid, we knew exactly what you were to him." They threw her onto a horse, securing the silver chains to the saddle with efficient brutality. One of the injured mercenaries shot her a venomous look as he wrapped his mangled hand, the fingers she'd taken already blackening with infection. "Bitch took my fingers," he snarled. "Should have been faster," the leader replied without sympathy. "We ride hard, 6 days to the capital." "Silas wants her before the deadline." What deadline, Lydia tried to ask, but the words came out as a croak. Her throat burned where the silver collar pressed against her skin, the metal drawing strength from her body with every breath. "The deadline when your precious Alpha King sends his beta to fetch you," the leader answered anyway, spurring his horse forward. "We'll have you locked in Silas's dungeon long before then. And when Kade Wolfhart comes to bargain for your life, we'll have everything we need to destroy him." The journey began at a punishing pace, horses driven hard through terrain that would have been treacherous even in good weather. The mercenaries clearly knew these mountains, following paths that avoided main routes, keeping to shadows and valleys where watchers would be scarce. They were professionals, expensive ones, and that meant Silas's conspiracy had serious funding behind it. She hurled her consciousness toward Kade, clawing desperately for their connection, even as the silver fought to sever it. Pain exploded through her chest, white hot and consuming, but she gritted her teeth and pushed harder. The connection was there, buried under layers of metallic interference, but still present, still real. For one brilliant second, something pushed back. awareness, recognition. Kade somewhere far away feeling her distress and responding with fury that burned through the bond like wildfire. Then the silver clamped down again, severing the connection and leaving her gasping. "Stop trying," the leader called back, having noticed her struggle. "He can't save you. Even if he feels your fear, he won't know where to find you. By the time we reach the capital, it'll be too late." On the second day, one of the younger mercenaries made the mistake of sitting beside Lydia during their midday rest. He was drunk, his tongue loosened by whatever cheap whiskey he carried in his water skin, and apparently thought a captive Omega made suitable company. "Never thought I'd be transporting the Alpha King's mate," he slurred, taking another long pull. "Silas is paying triple our usual rate for this job." "Triple? You know what that means." Lydia said nothing, conserving her strength, but the mercenary didn't need encouragement. "Means you're valuable. Means the plan is big. Real big." He leaned closer, his breath reeking of alcohol. "Silas is going to use you to make the king abdicate. Public ceremony on all the territories watching. Kade Wolfhart gets on his knees and names Silas as his successor, or you die." Her blood turned to ice. This was worse than murder. This was a complete transfer of power, a coup dressed up as legitimate succession, and she was the leverage that would make it possible. But here's the secret: the drunk mercenary continued, apparently finding this hilarious. "After the king abdicates, Silas kills you anyway. Right in front of him. Because killing a mate doesn't just break the heart, it breaks the wolf, severs the connection permanently. The king becomes weak, powerless, easy to eliminate. The mate bond. The thing that had saved Kade's life when she'd carried him through the blizzard. The thing that had awakened her wolf after 7 years of silence. The thing that made her whole would be used to destroy the man she'd only just found." "How many others are working with Silas?" Lydia asked, her voice hoarse. The mercenary shrugged. "2 territorial alphas for sure. Victor Cross from the Eastern Reach. Connor Gray from the Western Plains. They've pledged their armies. 3,000 wolves, ready to march if the coup goes wrong. But it won't go wrong, not with you as the bait. 3,000 soldiers. 2 territorial alphas willing to commit treason. A conspiracy that had been building for years, patient and methodical, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And her father had discovered it had been investigating Silas when he died. Samuel Hawthorne had given his life trying to expose this plot, and now his daughter would be used to complete it. The knowledge sat in her stomach like lead as the journey continued. On the 4th day, desperation made her reckless. She stopped trying to finesse the connection and simply threw everything she had against the barrier. This time she didn't try to send words or images, just raw emotion. Fear, danger, coming. The silver fought her every inch, burning through her veins like acid, but she pushed through the agony with stubborn determination. The response came faster this time, stronger. Kade's fury blazing across their connection like a beacon, along with something else. Recognition, understanding. He knew she was in danger. Whether he knew specifics or could pinpoint her location remained unclear, but he knew something was wrong. "Enough," the leader snarled, yanking his horse alongside hers. He grabbed her face, forced her to look at him. "I said stop trying to reach him. You want me to add more silver? Because I can make this collar so heavy you can't lift your head." Lydia spat in his face. The backhand came fast and hard, splitting her lip and filling her mouth with blood. But the small act of defiance felt good, felt necessary, a reminder that she wasn't completely powerless, even wrapped in chains. "You've got spirit," the leader admitted, wiping her saliva from his cheek. "Good. Silas likes them spirited, makes the breaking more entertaining." On the 5th day, everything Lydia thought she understood about betrayal shattered into something worse. They had stopped to water the horses at a narrow stream when the leader rode up beside her again. His expression held something ugly, something that looked almost like anticipation. "Your sister sends her regards," he said casually. Lydia's heart stopped. "What's Sarah Hawthorne?" The leader's smile was cruel, savoring her shock. "Or should I say Sarah Cross now, Luna to Alpha Victor Cross of the Eastern Reach, one of Silas's co-conspirators." No, the word came out, barely a whisper. "You're lying." "Why would I lie?" He seemed genuinely amused by her distress. "She's been quite helpful, actually. Told us all about your cowardly escape 4 years ago. How you abandoned her to face the pack's judgment alone. How you were always the weak one, the broken one, the disappointment. Memories crashed over Lydia like waves. Sarah at 14, beautiful and perfect, the daughter who could do no wrong. Sarah at 20, graceful and poised, everything their father had wanted in an heir to his healing knowledge. Sarah the night before Lydia's planned wedding, crying and begging her not to run. "Don't leave me," Sarah had sobbed, gripping Lydia's hands. "Please don't leave me alone." But had it really been grief? Or had there been something else in her sister's eyes that night? Relief, perhaps. Satisfaction. She married Victor 2 years ago. The leader continued, clearly enjoying this. Big ceremony. Half the Eastern Reach attended. And she'll be at your execution, front row seat, watching her broken little sister finally get what's coming to her. Lydia couldn't breathe, couldn't think past the roaring in her ears. Her sister, the person she'd mourned for 4 years, the person she'd felt guilty about abandoning, had not only moved on, but had actively betrayed her, had married one of the conspirators, had helped them find her. Everything she'd believed about family, about blood bonds, about the sister who'd cried for her, crumbled to dust. Why Lydia finally managed? Why would she do this? The leader shrugged. Power, probably. Victor promised her queenship over an expanded territory, promised her respect status, everything she thought she deserved. Turns out your sister is ambitious. Who knew the rest of that day passed in a blur of numbness? Lydia barely registered the cold, barely felt the silver burning her skin. Her mind kept circling back to Sarah, trying to reconcile the sister she'd known with the woman who'd allied herself with their father's murderers. Samuel Hawthorne had died investigating Silas's conspiracy, and Sarah had married into it, had helped it, had chosen power over the loyalty to their father's memory. The betrayal was so complete, so absolute that Lydia couldn't find room for it in her understanding of the world. The capital rose before them on the sixth day, a sprawling fortress city carved into mountainside stone. Black towers pierced the sky, their peaks disappearing into low clouds. Even from a distance, Lydia could feel the concentrated power emanating from within those walls. Hundreds of shifters, maybe thousands, all gathered in one place. The mercenaries dragged her through streets crowded with merchants and soldiers, none of whom spared a second glance at the chained woman on horseback. In a city this size, misery was commonplace enough to be invisible. Lydia kept her head high, despite the humiliation, despite the exhaustion, despite knowing that death waited somewhere in the fortress ahead. The castle itself was a monument to dominance. Massive gates opened into a courtyard large enough to hold an entire village. Guards lined the walls, their eyes tracking every movement with predatory focus. Lydia's wolf whimpered beneath the silver collar, overwhelmed by the sheer concentration of dominant energy pressing down from all directions. They hauled her off the horse and through corridors of polished stone, past tapestries depicting ancient battles and conquered territories. The wealth on display was staggering, a reminder that the Alpha King commanded not just wolves but resources, trade routes, entire economies. And she was supposed to be Luna to all of this. The thought would have been laughable if it wasn't so tragic. The throne room doors swung open, revealing a space so vast it stole what little breath Lydia had left. Columns soared to a ceiling, lost in shadows. Torches blazed in iron sconces, casting dancing light across stone floors, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. And at the far end, raised on a dais, sat a single throne of black wood and silver inlay. The man occupying it was older than Kade, perhaps in his mid-50s, with silver threading through dark hair and cold eyes that assessed her with the precision of a merchant evaluating livestock. This had to be Silas Blackwood, the man who'd murdered her father, the man who'd poisoned Kade, the architect of a conspiracy that had destroyed her family and now threatened to destroy an entire kingdom. The Alpha King's horse Silas announced to the assembled court, his voice carrying effortlessly through the massive space. Captured in the frozen peaks, where she seduced our beloved king during his moment of weakness. Murmurs rippled through the gathered wolves. Lydia counted at least 50 present, all dressed in the finery of nobility or the leather of warriors. Power radiated from many of them alphas, from various territories gathered to witness whatever spectacle Silas had planned. "I'm no one's whore," Lydia said, clearly proud that her voice didn't shake despite the silver chains and her nakedness beneath the thin blanket. "I saved a dying wolf from the snow. That's all." Silas smiled, the expression holding no warmth. "How convenient that the wolf you saved happened to be the most powerful shifter in existence. How fortunate that he spent 12 days in your isolated cabin with no witnesses to contradict whatever poison you dripped in his ears. I poisoned no one. Lydia met his eyes directly, refusing to cower, despite knowing it was probably suicide. But someone did. Someone who knew exactly what mixture of wolfsbane and silver would kill an Alpha King slowly enough for him to escape. Someone who had access to the Royal Council's wine. The room went utterly silent. Several wolves shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between Silas and Lydia. She'd struck a nerve, exposed something that at least some of them had suspected. Careful girl. Silas's smile froze into something uglier. Accusations against the acting regent require proof you don't possess. Acting regent Lydia's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Is that what you're calling yourself? Now that you think Kade is dead? The king, as Silas began, but a voice cut through the throne room with undeniable authority. The king is very much alive. Every head turned. Kade Wolfhart stood in the doorway, flanked by a dozen armed wolves. He was dressed for battle leather and steel, replacing the simple clothes he had worn at her cabin. His beard was freshly trimmed, his black hair pulled back, and his amber eyes blazed with barely contained rage. He looked every inch the warrior king, and the power rolling off him made several lesser wolves drop to their knees instinctively. Lydia's heart slammed against her ribs. He'd come. Despite the danger, despite walking into an obvious trap, he'd come for her. Kade Silas rose slowly from the throne. We thought you dead. This is a joyous occasion. Save your lies. Kade descended into the throne room, his wolves fanning out behind him. Lydia recognized the largest, a sandy-haired man with warrior scars and shrewd eyes. Garrett Stone, the beta Kade had promised to send. I know what you did. I know about the poison. I know about the conspiracy. I know you murdered Dr. Samuel Hawthorne 4 years ago when he discovered your embezzling. Gasps echoed through the court, confirmation of what some had suspected, but none had dared speak aloud. You know nothing, Silas spat, his mask of civility cracking. You have no proof of anything. I have enough. Kade's gaze found Lydia across the room, and something in his expression softened fractionally before hardening again. Release her. Now. I think not. Silas snapped his fingers and more wolves emerged from side doors, armed and ready. You see, my king, you've walked into a trap. You care for this broken Omega. You'd do anything to protect her. So here's my offer. Abdicate the throne, publicly name me your successor, and I'll let her live. No deal. Kade's hand moved to the sword at his hip. Let her go or I take her by force. Silas laughed. You're outnumbered 3-1. My wolves are loyal. They'll cut you down before you reach the dais. Your wolves. Garrett's voice carried clearly through the tension. Look again, traitor. As if choreographed, half of Silas's supposed supporters turned weapons, now aimed at their former allies rather than at Kade. The throne room exploded into chaos. Steel rang against steel. Wolves shifted mid-leap, fur and fangs replacing human flesh and heartbeats. Lydia tried to move, desperate to help, but the silver chains held her in place, forcing her to watch helplessly as violence erupted around her. Kade fought his way toward her, cutting through opponents with brutal efficiency. Every kill brought him closer, his movements displaying decades of training and natural dominance. This wasn't the injured wolf she'd nursed in her cabin. This was the Alpha King in his element, a warrior who'd earned his throne through strength and cunning. The girl, Silas shrieked, panic replacing his earlier confidence. Kill the girl. An enemy wolf broke from the melee, charging straight for Lydia. She could see death in its eyes, jaws opening wide to rip out her throat. The silver prevented shifting, prevented defense, left her completely vulnerable. Time seemed to slow as the wolf leaped, as teeth aimed for her jugular, as she realized this was how she would die. Then Kade was there, intercepting the attack with impossible speed. He shifted mid-motion, his massive black wolf form slamming into the enemy and bearing it to the ground. The sound of tearing flesh, of snapping bone, echoed sickeningly. When Kade shifted back to human, blood stained his hands and chest, and the enemy wolf lay dead at his feet. He turned to Lydia, began working frantically at her chains. I've got you. I should have sent Garrett sooner. I felt your fear through the bond, but couldn't pinpoint where. I'm sorry. Behind you, Lydia screamed. Kade spun, but not fast enough. Silas's blade caught him across the ribs, opening a deep gash that immediately began bleeding heavily. Kade staggered, and Silas pressed his advantage, driving the sword toward Lydia's chest. If I can't have the throne, neither can you, Silas snarled. Time fractured. Lydia saw the blade coming, saw Kade trying to intercept, but too injured to move fast enough, saw her own death reflected in polished steel. The sword plunged into her abdomen, punching through flesh and muscle with agonizing precision. Pain exploded through her body, white-hot and all-consuming. She gasped, tasted copper, felt warmth spread across her skin as blood poured from the wound. But beneath the pain, something else stirred. Deep within her core, where her father's blood ran through her veins, power awakened. Not the wolf, not shift or strength. Something older. Something Samuel Hawthorne had given her with his dying breath, hidden so deep, she'd never known it existed until this moment of absolute need. Silver light erupted from Lydia's hands so bright it illuminated every corner of the throne room. The chains holding her, shattered, melting away like ice before flame. The sword in her gut glowed white-hot, forcing Silas to release it with a scream of agony. Lydia wrapped her hands around the blade still embedded in her flesh and pulled. It came free in a spray of blood and light, the impossible wound beneath already beginning to close. Flesh knit together at speeds that defied nature's skin sealing over muscle, until nothing remained but smooth unbroken skin and a dress soaked in her own blood. "What is this?" Silas stumbled backward, terror replacing triumph. "What are you?" "My father's daughter," Lydia said, and her voice carried power that made wolves cower. "Samuel Hawthorne knew you killed him. Before he died, he performed a ritual. He gave me his gift, amplified it, and hid it so deep I wouldn't discover it until I needed it most." She moved towards Silas, light still streaming from her palms. Around the room, the battle had paused, all eyes on the Omega, who glowed like a fallen star. "You took my father. You tried to take my mate. You've killed innocents and betrayed your king for nothing but power." "No more." Her hands rose silver light intensifying, ready to end the man who'd destroyed so much. But before she could act, Kade was there. His hand closed around Silas's throat, lifting the traitor off his feet with contemptuous ease. "This death is mine," Kade said quietly, and snapped Silas's neck with a single brutal motion. The body crumpled to the throne room floor. The remaining conspirators, seeing their leader fall, dropped their weapons and surrendered. The battle was over in heartbeats, the throne room suddenly still except for the heavy breathing of survivors and the groans of the wounded. Lydia turned to Kade, her power still crackling across her skin. He was bleeding badly, the wound deep enough to be serious even for an Alpha King. Without thinking, she pressed her glowing hands to his ribs. The light flowed from her into him, carrying healing with it. His flesh knit together beneath her palms, the gash closing as quickly as her own wound had. Around the room, injured loyalists gasped as that same healing light touched them, mending cuts and broken bones with effortless precision. When the power finally faded, when the last wound was closed and the last pain eased, Lydia swayed. Exhaustion pulled at her bones, the cost of using so much power suddenly catching up. Kade caught her before she could fall, holding her against his chest. "Easy," he murmured. "That took everything out of you." "Did we win?" Lydia asked, though she already knew the answer. "This battle, yes." Garrett approached, his expression grim. "But messengers just arrived. Victor Cross and Connor Gray have mobilized their armies. 3,000 wolves marching on the capital. They'll be here in 3 weeks. 3 weeks wasn't enough time to prepare for war, but it was all they had. The days blurred together in a cascade of strategy meetings, troop movements, and desperate preparations. Lydia found herself thrust into a role she'd never imagined, standing beside Kade in the war room as territorial alphas pledged their forces and generals debated tactics. The wolf they'd branded defective, who'd hidden in the mountains for 4 years, was gone, replaced by something harder. Something forged in silver, chains, and awakened power. But not everyone welcomed her transformation. The challenge came on the third day during a council meeting with the remaining territorial alphas. An older wolf named Marcus Thornton stood abruptly, his weathered face twisted with disapproval. "She's a rejected Omega with no pack standing. How can she possibly be Luna to the 7 territories?" The room fell silent. 60 wolves watched to see how Lydia would respond, whether she'd crumble under scrutiny or prove herself worthy of the title Kade had claimed for her. "You were injured in the battle against Silas's forces," Lydia said calmly, approaching the Alpha with measured steps. "Correct." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Old injury, shoulder, hasn't healed right in 10 years. What of it?" Lydia placed her hand on his shoulder, and silver light bloomed beneath her palm. The healing flowed through her touch, decades of scar tissue and damaged muscle reforming bone fragments that had never set properly dissolving and realigning. Marcus gasped, rotating his arm in disbelief as full mobility returned for the first time in a decade. My worth isn't determined by wolves too blind to see it, Lydia said quietly. Do you have any other questions? Alpha Thornton, the older wolf, dropped to one knee, his head bowed. No, Luna. Forgive my doubt. Around the table, other alphas nodded their approval. Kade caught her eye from across the room, pride and possession warring in his amber gaze. She was learning to navigate this world of politics and power, learning that strength came in forms her old pack had never recognized. The War Council reconvened that afternoon, maps spread across the massive table in the strategy room. Victor Cross and Connor Gray would coordinate a two-pronged attack. Garrett explained his finger-tracing routes on the map. Eastern forces here, Western forces here. They'll converge on the capital, simultaneously forcing us to split our defenses. Lydia studied the terrain patterns emerging that others seemed to miss. Connor Gray is a Korean War veteran. He'll use forced marches through mountain passes, hit us when we're exhausted from holding position. It's the same strategy he used at Chosin Reservoir. Kade turned to her, surprise flickering across his features. How do you know military history? My father served before becoming a healer. She traced a different route on the map, one that would turn the enemy's strategy against them. He taught me tactics through his war stories. He and your father served together in Korea, actually. The revelation hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Their fathers had been brothers in arms, had survived hell together, had built a friendship that transcended pack politics. And now their children stood together facing a different kind of war, but bound by the same unbreakable loyalty. We use the passes as kill zones, Lydia continued, pushing past the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. Let them think we're defending statically, then collapse the flanks once they're committed. Trap them in the valleys where their numbers become a liability. Kade's expression shifted to something darker, more predatory. We use your strategy. His gaze swept the assembled generals. Prepare the troops. We have 3 weeks to turn this capital into a fortress and these mountains into a graveyard. The nights were harder than the days, alone in the royal chambers that still felt too large, too grand, too much like a cage gilded in silk and silver. Lydia struggled with the weight of everything that had happened. She'd gone from isolation to the center of a kingdom in less than a month, and the whiplash left her reeling. Kade found her on the balcony on the 12th night, staring out at the capital, spread below like a sea of flickering lights. He approached quietly, wrapping a cloak around her shoulders against the cold mountain air, then pulling her back against his chest. You're thinking too loud, he murmured. I can feel your worry through the bond. Tomorrow we finalize troop positions. Lydia leaned into his warmth, craving the connection even as doubt gnawed at her. 3,000 enemy wolves marched toward us, led by the man my sister chose over her own blood. How am I supposed to face her, Kade? How do I look at Sarah and not see every moment she lied, every tear that was manipulation? His arms tightened around her. You face her the same way you face the mercenaries who chained you, the same way you face Silas. You show her that the broken little sister she dismissed is stronger than she ever imagined. And if I'm not, the question came out smaller than she intended. What if I'm still that rejected Omega pretending to be something more? Kade turned her in his arms, forcing her to meet his eyes. The mate bond between them hummed with certainty, with absolute conviction that left no room for doubt. You stopped being that Omega the moment you dragged a dying Alpha King 6 miles through a blizzard. You were never broken, Lydia. You were waiting, and now you're exactly where you're meant to be. He kissed her then deep and claiming a reminder of what they were to each other. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against hers, their breath mingling in the cold air. When this is over, when we've dealt with Victor and Connor and your sister's betrayal, we're going back to that cabin. Just you and me. No crowns, no politics, no armies. Just us. How long? Lydia asked, a smile tugging at her lips despite everything. A month. His answering smile was fierce. Maybe 2. However long it takes for you to remember what it felt like before all this. Before you had to be Luna instead of just being mine. The promise settled into her chest beside the mate bond, another anchor to hold on to when the weight of responsibility threatened to drown her. The armies arrived at dawn on the 21st day, their approach heralded by scouts who'd been tracking their movements for days. 3,000 wolves spread across 2 fronts, their formations precise and disciplined, under the command of experienced alphas who'd spent years preparing for this moment. Kade's forces numbered 2,000, bolstered by fortifications and the advantage of defending their own territory. It should have been enough. But wars weren't won by numbers alone, and everyone gathered on the capital's walls knew that the next 3 days would determine the fate of the 7 territories. Lydia stood in the field hospital, surrounded by supplies and the grim-faced healers she'd been training for the past 2 weeks. Her gift had limits. She couldn't heal everyone, couldn't be everywhere at once. But she'd found 50 wolves with raw talent for the healing arts, had poured everything her father had taught her into crash courses on field medicine and emergency treatment. They would need every bit of that knowledge before this was over. The first wave hit at noon Eastern, and Western forces attacking in perfect synchronization. The sound was overwhelming, thousands of wolves colliding in a cacophony of steel and snarls and screams. Lydia watched from the hospital position, protected by guards, but close enough to see the battle unfold, close enough to feel the mate bond stretch and pull as Kade commanded from the front lines. The casualties began flooding in within minutes. Wolves with gaping wounds that exposed bone and organs. Shifters who couldn't maintain their forms, flickering between human and animal as their bodies tried desperately to heal damage that exceeded their natural regeneration. Soldiers who would have died within minutes without intervention. Lydia moved through them like a force of nature, her hands glowing with silver light as she touched wound after wound. Flesh knit beneath her palms, broken bones realigned and bleeding stopped with a thought and a pulse of power. She worked until exhaustion made her hands shake, until her vision blurred with fatigue, until Kade's voice through the mate bond demanded she rest before she killed herself. But she couldn't stop, wouldn't stop, because every wolf she saved was one more fighter who could return to the battle, one more life preserved against the forces trying to tear their kingdom apart. "The Luna saved me," a young soldier whispered to his friend as Lydia moved to the next patient. "I was dead. I felt myself dying. Then she touched me and I was whole again." The whispers spread through the army like wildfire. The Luna heals. The Luna saves. The Luna is a miracle. By nightfall of the first day, 400 wolves had passed through her hands. 400 lives plucked from death's grip and sent back into the fight. The cost showed in the hollows beneath her eyes, the tremor in her fingers, the way she swayed when she finally allowed herself to stop. Kade found her slumped over a wounded soldier, her hands still glowing faintly as the last of her power trickled out. He scooped her up without a word, carrying her to the command tent and depositing her on a cot despite her protests. "Sleep," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "That's an order from your king and your mate. The soldiers need me." Lydia tried to argue, but her eyes were already closing. "They need you alive." He pulled a blanket over her, his touch gentler than his tone. "You're no good to anyone, dead love. Rest. I'll wake you if there's an emergency." She wanted to argue further, to insist she could keep going, but exhaustion dragged her under before she could form the words. She dreamed of her father. Samuel Hawthorne stood in a clearing filled with golden light, looking exactly as she remembered him. Younger than when he died, the stress lines around his eyes smoothed away, his smile warm and proud. "You were always meant for this, daughter," he said, his voice carrying across the impossible distance between life and death. "Not broken, forged. Every hardship, every rejection, every moment of pain shaped you into exactly what this kingdom needs." "I miss you," Lydia whispered. "I miss you so much." "I know." Samuel's form began to fade, the golden light brightening until it hurt to look at. "But you're not alone anymore. You have Kade. You have your power. You have a purpose that goes beyond survival. Wake up, Lydia. Wake up and finish what I started." She woke to chaos. The second day had brought renewed assault, and the enemy had changed tactics. Instead of broad fronts, they'd focused their forces on breakthrough points, trying to overwhelm defenses through concentrated pressure. The strategy was working. Eastern forces had penetrated the outer walls, and Western troops were engaging defenders in close quarters, combat that negated the advantages of fortification. Lydia threw herself back into healing with renewed determination. Her dream of Samuel had left her energized, filled with purpose that pushed past physical exhaustion. She moved through the wounded with efficiency born of necessity, her gift flowing more smoothly now that she understood its limits and capabilities. But even miracles had their breaking points. By midday, she'd healed over 200 additional soldiers, and her power was sputtering like a candle in high wind. The silver light that usually flowed so freely now came in sporadic bursts, unreliable and weak. She tried to force more through sheer willpower, tried to ignore the way her hands shook and her vision grayed at the edges. The next patient was a young female soldier, barely 20, with a gut wound that was clearly fatal. Lydia pressed her hands to the injury, calling on power that simply wasn't there anymore. Nothing happened. The light flickered once and died. "Please," the soldier whispered, blood bubbling at her lips. "Please, Luna. I don't want to die." Tears streamed down Lydia's face as she held the girl's hand, offering comfort instead of healing, because she had nothing left to give. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The soldier died 3 minutes later, her eyes fixed on Lydia's face, confusion and betrayal warring in their depths. Garrett found Lydia an hour after that, still sitting beside the dead soldier's body, her face blank with shock and grief. He gently pulled her to her feet, guided her away from the hospital toward a quiet corner of the fortifications. "You can't save everyone," he said quietly. "Even with your gift, you're not invincible." "I should have been able to save her." Lydia's voice was hollow, scraped raw by guilt. "She was so young, she had her whole life ahead of her. And because of you, 400 other soldiers got to keep their lives." Garrett gripped her shoulders, forcing her to focus on him instead of the spiral of self-recrimination. "You've done more in 2 days than most healers manage in lifetimes. But you're still mortal, Lydia, still limited. And if you burn yourself out trying to save everyone, you'll end up saving no one." The practical words cut through her grief, anchoring her back to reality. She was exhausted, depleted, running on fumes and stubbornness. If she kept pushing, she'd collapse completely, and then who would heal the wounded tomorrow? On the third day, Kade led the final assault. The enemy forces had been ground down by 2 days of brutal combat, their numbers reduced by nearly a third. But Victor Cross and Connor Gray still commanded formidable armies, and they'd adapted to every tactic thrown at them. The battle had reached a stalemate, both sides too evenly matched to gain decisive advantage, until Kade decided to change the rules entirely. He led a strike force of 50 elite warriors straight into the heart of Victor's command position, abandoning defense for pure aggressive offense. The move was reckless, bordered on suicidal, but it was also exactly what the enemy didn't expect. By the time Victor's forces reacted, Kade was already through their lines and bearing down on the Eastern Alpha himself. Lydia felt every moment of the fight through their mate bond, felt Cade's fury as he cut through enemies, felt the sharp spike of pain when a blade found his shoulder, felt his savage satisfaction when he finally stood face to face with the Alpha, who'd allied with Silas and betrayed the crown. The fight between Kade and Victor lasted less than 3 minutes, but felt like an eternity filtered through the mate bond. Both Alphas shifted, massive wolves tearing at each other, with tooth and claw blood staining the ground beneath them. Victor was powerful, experienced, motivated by ambition and the promise of expanded territory. But Kade fought for something deeper, for his mate, for his kingdom, for justice owed to a murdered healer and the daughter who'd been left alone. When Victor's throat tore open beneath Cade's jaws, when the Eastern Alpha fell dead in the mud, the fight went out of his army like air from a punctured lung. Wolves who'd been willing to die for their Alpha suddenly lost their conviction when faced with continuing without him. The Western forces, seeing the Eastern armies collapse, found themselves outmaneuvered by Garrett's tactical brilliance. Trapped in the mountain passes exactly as Lydia had predicted, they were forced to surrender or face annihilation. Connor Gray chose surrender. By sunset of the third day, the war was over. 3 days instead of 3 weeks. A victory bought with blood and strategy, and the kind of healing gift that had kept soldiers fighting when they should have been dead. Lydia moved through the battlefield in the fading light, offering healing to friend and former foe alike. Enemy soldiers looked at her with confusion and something like awe as she closed their wounds, asking nothing in return. "Why do you heal me?" one asked through tears. "I tried to kill you. I marched against your king." "Because I'm Luna," Lydia replied simply. And Luna doesn't abandon any of her wolves. Even the ones who didn't know they were hers yet. The public trials were held a week later, once the dead had been buried and the wounded had recovered enough to bear witness. The throne room filled with every territorial Alpha who could make the journey. 70 powerful wolves gathered to see justice served and order restored. Connor Gray was brought in first, still bearing the marks of battle, but holding himself with dignity despite the chains. He was 50 years old, a Korean War veteran who'd served with honor before making the catastrophic decision to side with Silas's conspiracy. Connor Gray Cade's voice carried through the assembled crowd. You served with my father in Korea. You were a hero, a wolf respected across all territories. Why did you betray that legacy? Connor met his gaze without flinching. Silas promised autonomy, promised my territory freedom from central interference. I believed him. His jaw tightened. I was wrong. I accept responsibility for my choice. What should your punishment be? Kate asked. Lydia stepped forward before anyone else could speak. Exile, not death. Murmurs rippled through the court. To show mercy to a conspirator seemed weak to wolves who understood only strength and dominance. But Lydia held her ground, meeting Connor's eyes across the throne room. You fought with honor. You surrendered when you saw the cause was wrong. You deserve a second chance. She turned to Cade. Exile him beyond the northern territories. If he returns, then death. But give him his life. Cade studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Luna has spoken. Connor Gray, you are exiled beyond our borders. Go and be grateful for her mercy. Connor bowed deeply, his eyes suspiciously bright. You are kind, Luna. May your reign be long. Then they brought in Sarah. Lydia's sister looked smaller than she remembered, diminished by chains and defeat. Her beauty remained that perfect symmetry that had always made Lydia feel plain by comparison, but something harsh had settled into her features. The softness was gone, replaced by edges sharp enough to cut. Their eyes met across the throne room, and for one heartbeat, Lydia saw her sister as she'd been. 12 years old and laughing, 16 and teaching Lydia to braid her hair, 20 and crying the night before Lydia's planned wedding. Then Sarah's expression hardened, and the illusion shattered. Sarah Cross, Kate announced. Luna to the traitor Victor Cross. You stand accused of conspiracy against the crown, providing intelligence to our enemies, and aiding in the attempted murder of your Alpha King. How do you answer guilty? Sarah's voice was steady, defiant. I married Victor willingly. I supported his claim. I have no regrets. Lydia stepped forward, pain lancing through her chest, despite knowing this confrontation was inevitable. Why, Sarah, I was your sister. You begged me not to leave. Something cracked in Sarah's composure. Years of resentment poured out in a torrent. Always in your shadow, father obsessed over fixing you while I was invisible despite being perfect. I was strong, capable, everything a pack values, but did anyone notice? No. Only poor broken Lydia mattered. When you ran, your shame became mine. Victor saw me, chose me for my strength, not out of pity. He gave me the respect I deserved, but never received in your shadow. The words struck like physical blows, each one a revelation of just how deep Sarah's jealousy ran. Lydia had known her sister resented her, but she'd never understood the true depth of that bitterness. So you allied with father's murderers. Lydia's voice remained steady despite the tears threatening to fall. You helped them because you felt overlooked. I helped them because I deserved more than being your sister. Sarah's mask shattered completely, tears streaming down her face. Please, Lydia, I'm sorry. I was angry. I wasn't thinking clearly. You can't let them kill me. I'm still your sister. The manipulation was obvious. The crocodile tears, a tactic Sarah had used since childhood. Lydia saw through it, clearly recognized the performance for what it was. You're already in a prison, Lydia said quietly. Jealousy, bitterness, regret. You built your own cage, Sarah. Killing you would be a mercy. She turned to Cade, her decision made. Exile. Send her beyond the frozen peaks. Let the mountains that sheltered me become her prison. Let her survive alone with nothing but her choices for company. Cade's eyes held a question, making sure this was truly what she wanted. Lydia nodded once firmly. So be it, Cade declared. Sarah Cross is exiled beyond the northern borders. Any who aid her face the same fate. Sarah's screams echoed through the throne room as guards dragged her away, curses and pleas mixing into incoherent noise. Lydia watched until the doors closed, cutting off her sister's voice, then allowed herself one tear. One moment of grief for the relationship that might have been if Sarah had chosen differently. Cade's hand found hers warm and steady, anchoring her back to the present. That night, the claiming ceremony transformed the throne room into something almost beautiful. Flowers and candles replaced weapons and blood, ancient symbols of mate bonds painted on walls that had witnessed so much violence. Every territorial alpha attended, dressed in ceremonial finery, gathered to witness something that happened perhaps once in a generation. the formal recognition of a fated mate bond. Lydia wore midnight blue silk that made her skin glow in the candlelight, her chestnut hair braided with silver threads and crystals. She looked like a queen, felt like an imposter, but held her head high, because that's what Luna did. Kade wore ceremonial armor, black steel inlaid with silver wolf runes that caught the light with every movement. The crown sat on his head for the first time since his poisoning, a circlet of worked silver that marked him as something more than just an alpha. He was magnificent, terrifying, everything a king should be. And when he looked at her, none of that mattered. In his eyes, she was simply his mate, his Lydia, the woman who'd saved him in a blizzard and claimed his heart without trying. I claim this woman as my mate, Kate's voice carried through the throne room with undeniable authority. Lydia Hawthorne, daughter of Samuel Hawthorne, healer survivor, keeper of the ancient gift. She is mine by choice and destiny. Let anyone who challenges this claim challenge me. Silence greeted his words. Not even the most foolish wolf would dare. Do you accept? Kate asked, his eyes locked on hers. I accept. Lydia's voice rang clear and strong. I claim you as my mate, Kade Wolfhart, Alpha King of the 7 territories. I choose you freely, completely, for as long as we live. The mate bond flared between them, visible to everyone present. Golden light wrapped around their joined hands, spread up their arms, surrounded their bodies in a nimbus of power that spoke of something ancient and unbreakable. Gasps echoed through the throne room wolves, witnessing magic that most only heard about in stories. The claiming was complete in the eyes of their people. But the private ceremony still waited. In chambers sealed against intrusion, Kade removed her gown with reverent hands, his touch both gentle and possessive. My Luna, he murmured against her skin. My queen, my everything. My king, Lydia breathed. My mate, my home. The claiming bite when it came was both pain and pleasure, so intense she cried out. His teeth sank into the junction of her neck and shoulder, marking her permanently, with a rune that glowed silver against her skin. The mate bond snapped into absolute completion, tying them together in ways that transcended flesh. Then she bit him, in return her own mark appearing on his shoulder, and the bond became unbreakable. Not just mated, but claimed. Not just connected, but fused into something that death itself would struggle to separate. Afterward, wrapped in silk sheets in each other, Kade traced the mark on her shoulder with gentle fingers. Any regrets? He asked quietly. None. Lydia smiled, feeling more complete than she ever had. This is where I belong. 6 months passed in a blur of reconstruction and reform. The capital transformed under their joint rule prosperity, returning to streets that had known only tension during Silas's machinations. The royal council was reformed to include representatives from every rank, not just dominant alphas. 3 Omegas sat on the council, now their voices heard and valued in ways that would have been unthinkable a year ago. Lydia's healing network expanded across all 7 territories, 50 trained healers saving lives that would have been lost to injury or illness. She'd found her father's hidden journals in the castle archives, decades of research and wisdom that she now passed on to the next generation. And in her private chambers, standing before a mirror, as winter's first snow began to fall, she placed a hand on the swell of her abdomen. 5 months pregnant. The heir to the 7 territories growing inside her, a child who would inherit both Kade's strength and her healing gift, if the old texts about such things were true. Kade found her there, wrapping his arms around her from behind and placing his hands over hers on their child. You're thinking too loud again. I want to go back, Lydia said, to the cabin. Before winter makes it impossible, before I'm too pregnant to travel, before duties trap us here permanently. Then we go. Tomorrow. The journey took 3 days by horse, retracing the path she'd walked when carrying him through the blizzard. The mountains looked different now. Less forbidding, more familiar, as if by claiming them as her sanctuary for 4 years, she'd earned the right to see their beauty instead of just their harshness. The cabin appeared through the trees exactly as she'd left it, small, rough, perfect in its simplicity. Lydia dismounted carefully, her pregnant belly making her movements more deliberate, and stood in the doorway, breathing in the scent of pine and old smoke. This is where it all started, Kade said softly, coming to stand behind her. Right here. I opened my eyes in this room, expecting death or darkness, and instead I saw an angel covered in blood and snow, absolutely furious that I might have the audacity to die after she'd dragged me 6 miles through hell. I thought you were a rogue who'd bring me nothing but trouble. Lydia leaned back against his chest, letting his warmth surround her. Turns out I was absolutely right about the trouble part. Best trouble you ever found. They spent that first evening simply existing in the space. Kade rebuilt the fire in the hearth that had kept them both alive. Lydia prepared simple food from their supplies, moving around the tiny kitchen with muscle memory from 4 years of solitary survival. Neither spoke much, but the silence was comfortable, full of shared understanding rather than empty of words. The second day they hunted as wolves chestnut and black moving through pristine snow. Lydia's pregnant body moved differently now. Her wolf instinctively more cautious, protective of the life growing within. Kade stayed close, his massive form a constant shield, his wolf's need to protect his mate and unborn cub overriding everything else. When they brought down a deer together, working in perfect synchronization, her speed driving it toward his power, Lydia felt something fundamental click into place. This was pack. Not the political structure she'd been rejected from, not the hierarchy and posturing that had broken her years ago. This was the truth beneath all of that. Two wolves hunting together, two mates building a future. Simple and profound and exactly what she'd needed without knowing she needed it. That evening, wrapped in blankets by the fire, Kade placed his hands on her belly where their child grew. The baby moved beneath his palms and his breath caught. My father never got to meet my mother's wolf, he said quietly, staring into the flames. She died in childbirth before her first shift. He always regretted that he'd never gotten to run with her, never seen that side of her. It haunted him until the day he died, this sense of incompleteness, of having loved someone whose whole self he'd never known. I'm sorry. Lydia covered his hands with hers, lacing their fingers together over their growing child. Don't be. He found joy anyway. Raised me alone, taught me everything he knew, showed me that mates aren't just about perfect circumstances in fairy tale romance. They're about choosing each other every single day, regardless of what the world throws at you. His hands spread wider, reverent. This child will know both parents' wolves. Will grow up seeing strength and gentleness, power and healing value in every rank. Will understand that broken things can heal stronger than they ever were whole. That's a gift, Lydia. That's what we're giving them, that so many others never get. You sound like your father, she murmured, sleep pulling at her. Good. He was the wisest man I've ever known. Took me 38 years and finding you to understand just how wise. Kade kissed her temple. Thank you for this, for agreeing to come back here, for letting me see where you survived, where you became the woman strong enough to save a dying king and then save his entire kingdom. Thank you for making survival mean something, Lydia whispered, for making these 4 years of hiding into preparation instead of waste, for seeing value in the Omega everyone else dismissed. On their final morning, they stood in the doorway together, looking back at the small space that had fundamentally changed both their lives. Snow fell gently, covering their footprints from the past 3 days, making the world new again. We'll come back every year, Kade promised, his arms solid around her shoulders. Teach our child to fish through ice, to track rabbits in snow, to appreciate silence and solitude. We'll tell them this is where their story began, where two people who'd been told they were broken refused to believe it and found each other instead. And when they ask why their Luna would live in such a small, rough cabin, we'll tell them the truth. Kade turned her to face him, his amber eyes fierce and tender at once. This is where a dismissed Omega saved an Alpha King, where two people who'd lost everything found something worth more than crowns or kingdoms, where love mattered more than politics or power or what anyone else thought was possible. We'll tell them that sometimes the smallest places hold the biggest transformations. Lydia kissed him then deep and claiming, tasting snow and promise in the future they'd fought for. When they finally pulled apart, she took one last look at the cabin, memorizing every detail. The rough-hewn table where she'd first treated his wounds, the floor where he'd lain dying while she'd worked through the night, the narrow bed where they'd shared their first kiss, the hearth that had kept them both alive. This place had been her prison once, her sanctuary, her hiding place from a cruel world. Now it was simply home, the place where everything had changed, where she'd stopped running and started fighting, where she'd discovered that broken was just another word for unfinished, and she'd finally found someone willing to help her complete the transformation. Ready? Kade asked, helping her onto her horse with gentle hands. Ready, Lydia said, and meant it in every possible way. Ready to leave this place. ready to return to it, ready to be Luna and mother and mate, ready to face whatever tomorrow brought as long as they faced it together. They rode back toward the capital, toward responsibility and crown, and the kingdom they'd saved together, carrying the peace of the mountains with them. Do you ever regret it, choosing me? Accepting all the complications that came with being my mate? Lydia thought about the girl she'd been, cast out, dismissed as worthless, hiding in the mountains and waiting to fade away. Then she thought about who she'd become. Healer Luna, mate to a king, mother to an heir. Strong where she'd been weak, valued where she'd been dismissed, loved where she'd been alone. Never, she said honestly. You saved me just as much as I saved you. Maybe more. The return to the capital was bittersweet, leaving their sanctuary behind, but returning to purpose and responsibility. The city greeted them with celebration news of the pregnancy having spread across the territories. Wolves lined the streets, cheering and howling their approval. That night, on the private balcony of their chambers, Lydia stood wrapped in Kade's arms and watched snow fall over the kingdom they'd built together. I'm not afraid anymore, she said quietly. Of winter, of the future, of who I am. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I belong. You are, Kade murmured against her hair. You're home. And he was right. Home wasn't the cabin or the castle, the mountains or the city. Home was him, their child. The life they'd chosen and claimed despite every obstacle placed in their path. Behind them, winter painted the world white. Ahead, whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. And that, Lydia thought as their child kicked beneath their joined hands and the mate bond hummed with contentment, was more than enough. It was everything.